There are many obstacles that can block the path to a successful software project. When you come across one, it helps to think like a seasoned hiker and follow the trail marked by blue blazes around the problem so that you can get back on course and keep moving forward. Welcome to Blue Blazes Podcast. I'm your host for the journey, Jay Tower, and I'm a partner and principal consultant at Trailhead Technology Partners. In this series, we talk with industry experts who share their best tips for avoiding the pitfalls on the path to successful software projects. My guest on this episode of Blue Blazes is Corey Weathers. Corey is passionate about sharing the magic of software and does a lot of that sharing in his role as the America's Developer Relations Lead at Auth0, now a division of Okta. Whether speaking at tech conferences or meetups, building apps live on Twitch, or appearing on a podcast, Corey is always thinking about how to equip other developers. He holds an MBA from the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley and a BS in Systems and Computer Science from Howard University. While a native New Yorker at heart, he's proud to call Pennsylvania his home. Corey and I spoke about identity and access management and how using a third-party provider can help make your software projects more predictably successful. Enjoy. All right, welcome to the podcast, Corey. Nice to have you.
I'm super excited to be with you, Jay. How you doing?
Doing really well. How are you?
I'm good. It's been a good start to the day. The weather seems to be super warm outside, so it feels like springtime, even though it's the winter. And so we're just rolling with it.
We're recording this in early February, but it doesn't feel like that in the parts of the country we're in. So that's awesome.
Yeah, which is very rare and bizarre, but we'll take it.
It is, yeah, but no complaints. And I see you're representing today your company, which is Auth0 and Okta. So let me start out before we get into all of the questions. Give me the elevator pitch. What does Okta and Auth0 do, and why would somebody want to use them?
So at Okta, we strive to make the world safe for people to use applications, right? And really, a big part of doing that is by understanding who people are. And so at Okta, we have a number of identity and security related products that enable applications to better understand who you are and to build for your particular use case or experience. And so the tagline we often use when we're out at events for Auth0, or even if you go to like the auth0.com website, is make identity our problem, not yours. Right. And it is very much this idea that like there's so many things that as application developers or even as people who use applications that you have to think about, that the least of your problems should be something like identity. But identity is so hard to get right if you really think about it. And in a day and age where so many folks are having to interact with applications in so many different ways, don't try to solve that yourself. Make it our problem so you can go focus on the things that matter to your users.
That's a great way to summarize it. You know, a big theme that seems to come out a lot on this podcast where we talk about making software projects more predictably successful is basically don't reinvent the wheel. There's tools out there. There's third-party security. There's all kinds of things where, you could probably write it and maybe it would be kind of fun if you're an engineering nerd like we are. But you're not going to do as good a job as somebody who spends their whole waking hours thinking about security or a component library or something like that, right?
Yeah, and this is where I enjoy, this is why I love the API ecosystem, and it's why I love packages, and it's why I love SDKs for things, because especially in a world like identity, where identity is moving just as rapidly as the next thing you could consider, that even when you sit down to say, hey, I'm on latest and greatest, you're probably one version behind. Yeah. And so I'm like, make it our problem. And thank you for keeping us employed.
Exactly. Well, and there's nothing maybe more important than security to do correctly, right? If you do kind of a crummy job of making your own UI components, it's not the end of the world. But if you do security wrong, it could be the end of your company.
Well, and this is where I often now spend a lot of time paying attention to like breaches that
Mm,
happen. Oftentimes, companies will tell you, sometime thereafter that they recognize that people had unauthorized access to information. And
mhm,
if you ever look at it and you look at like how someone gained that initial level of access, what you
mhm,
typically find is it's something where someone sent you like a phishing email, right?
mm,
So they sent
mhm,
you an email that they got you to click on something that you really should not have. Or
mhm,
alternatively, um, they've stolen your credentials.
mm,
Somehow, some way they were keylogging and they grabbed your
mhm,
username and password and doing something as simple as adding multi-factor authentication to your login could have helped prevent it. And yet so many
mhm.
folks don't. And so
Yeah,
as we talk about the importance of security, I also realize like there's an aspect of this around like making a good user experience around it. But the other
yeah,
side to it is truly just turn it on. It's almost like you close your front door, just make sure you lock it.
yeah, yeah, that's right. We all have locks on our front doors, but not everyone uses them, right?
That's right. And you'd be surprised how often it shows up in the world of software.
I'm sure. I'm sure. I mean, that's the easiest vulnerability is getting a person to do something, right? This actually hacking into the software is usually pretty hard, even if it's not great software.
That's right.
Humans are the weak link.
And in this regard, it's why I get excited about the future of identity.
Mm.
And I know we've got a lot to talk about, but people often talk
Yeah.
about passkeys and going passwordless and what
Yeah.
does that mean? But even all of that, I think, gets us to a place where we're far better than, hey, did you remember your password that was supposed to have an uppercase and a lowercase and 12 digits and a special character? And maybe you
Right.
did it in the right order. God
Yep.
heaven help us.
Yes, it'll be great as that technology improves, and I do wanna ask more about that, but let me clear the air about an elephant in the room first, which is I'm sure people listening have heard of Auth0, and I'm sure they've probably heard of Okta, but maybe not everybody realizes that that's the same organization today. So I'm sure you've answered this question before, but, uh, give the, uh, give the short version of that. What's the difference?
Yeah, and I'll give the context that I know. There are probably bits and pieces that I will get wrong, so
Sure.
forgive me. I joined Okta in 2022, and just shortly before, Okta had actually finished acquiring Auth0.
Mhm.
And so, as a developer, like the .NET developer in me loves Auth0. I've known Auth0 for years, but I'd only known Okta as the place where I went to go log in for my corporate infrastructure, right?
Mhm.
And so, one of the things that really does just make sense is, well, what does it mean to serve the identity needs, regardless of whether that person is, say, an end user or a customer to your application, or alternatively, if a person is a member of your employee's workforce. And so today, with the two sitting under one Okta, we now have two sides to the business. One side that's called the Customer Identity Cloud, and that is powered by Auth0. So everything you know and love about Auth0 is there and branded under the Customer Identity Cloud. And then there's the Workforce Identity Cloud, which is everything you know and sort of love about what is that login experience and making sure that your workforce
Mhm.
has access to the applications that they need to in a way where you can also administer it and
Yeah.
protect your users and ensure that information is not being maliciously accessed or
Mhm.
downloaded for other reasons.
So would it be fair to say that the split kind of goes internal users, external users a little bit?
To some extent, yeah.
Sure.
And the reason why I say to some extent is because what's beautiful about both workforce and customer identity cloud is you have use cases that may span both. Case in point,
Mhm.
you may be a developer who's building a B2B application, and you're saying, "Look, I want to be able to enable a corporate buyer to be able to do login with their own local identifiers, right? Whether it's they're using Gmail or they have a local AD instance or whatever that may
Mhm.
be. And the beautiful thing about the customer identity cloud or Auth0 in this way is that you can bring that into Auth0 and have that still power your identity and still have that power the experience for the user, while at the same time not also needing to get into anything else around, hey, how else is your corporate infrastructure set up or where
Yeah.
do you have your users? And so that makes it easy.
Yeah.
Um, but there's also the other side to this, which is we have a number of customers who also use parts of the workforce identity cloud for access to like automations. And so
Hmm.
we have a Okta marketplace that allows you to then connect up that data to other types of systems so that you can then either report out on it or use it in a downstream effect, whatever you may need to do inside of your corporate environment.
Okay. Very helpful. So let's say somebody's wanting to get started, they're building an application, or maybe they have a suite of existing applications and platforms and they want to start bringing them together. Who do they talk to first to figure out if they're an Auth0 customer or more of an Okta customer?
Yeah, good question. I mean, what I would typically tell folks is if you are starting out and your end user is someone who is probably not sitting behind a corporate firewall, you probably want Auth0, right? And Auth0.com is your home. If you're doing something whereby you need to, say, provision access for an employee user base,
Hmm.
then you want Okta.com and you want the Workforce Identity Cloud for that.
Okay, nice. I think that clears it up. Thanks for walking us through that. Another thing that I notice as a theme on this podcast is that, engineering decisions are always a trade-off. So when it comes to outsourcing your security to somebody else, there's a lot of upsides to that. We've alluded to a lot of them already. Don't reinvent the wheel. You don't want to invent security yourself and maybe not do it
Yeah.
right. What do you see as the things that you're giving up, maybe because of using a third party for that?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that I hear a lot of is control, right? People love to be able to understand, hey, if someone's logged in, I've got this data in my specific app environment. And
Mm-hmm.
I know that the only way that someone could maliciously access it is by
Hmm.
coming into either my servers or trying to do something that is taking advantage of an exploit in the code base I have itself, right? So there's
Hmm.
that aspect. The other side that we hear a lot about is pricing, right? Which is, well, if I have engineers who can build this and we can spin up our own servers and spin up our own
Right.
databases, like, why would I pay someone else to do this for me? And
Sure.
these are, I would say, interesting conversations to have.
Yeah.
um, I often refer folks to this notion of, well, you're not, when you pay for an Auth0, you're not just paying for a login box. You're not just paying for access to a user database. You get a ton of protection that comes. You get a
Yeah.
ton of access to the latest and greatest features in security and in all things identity. And
Yeah.
so just keep in mind that there's a value conversation to be had that's less about, hey, I can have my developers go program a login, a username and password with a little bit of
Right.
validation, right? It's less
Yep.
about that. And it's more about, well, what happens afterwards when you need to actually remove something from that database?
Right.
Or what happens later on when you think someone has gained access, but you don't have the records to tell?
Hmm.
What do you do? Then this
Yep.
gets really fun and interesting.
Yeah. 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 That's a great comparison. Uh, it is often the case that I think engineers feel like, oh, I could build this. And therefore, I think we jump to the conclusion that if you could build it, which is probably true, right? I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of engineers would be capable of building this given the time. But it also, in our heads, I think we oversimplify the problem until we get into the details. And I'm sure Okta and Auth0 both have millions of developer hours into their products, and you're getting all the benefit of that for whatever the monthly cost is, right?
Yeah. And this is also where I encourage folks, like what I love about software is um we're always in a space of, okay, well, if I can build it, then maybe someone else has done it. And so I
Hmm.
love open source for this, and there are
Yeah.
open source identity providers as well who have fully configurable systems that could totally work for your use case. I now, the Okta employee in me would probably be like, hey, you should purchase some Auth0 if it works for your use case. And that's true. But the flip side to this is, even if you say, look, I'm going to go use like an open source identity provider because I understand it and it
Hmm.
works well for what I need, that's good too, right? Because it gets you to a spot where you're not necessarily just relying on your own knowledge or your own expertise to
Sure.
deploy what is going to be your identity solution, which is one of the vectors to protect your application as well
Hmm.
as your infrastructure, right?
Yep.
So this is where I'm like, I'll take it just because you've thought about it and you've put the effort into researching and figuring out
Yeah.
what makes sense. as
Yeah,
opposed to, oh, it's time for us to build login. Let me just put some login boxes on the screen and press submit.
yeah. Now, a value add that I'm sure you all bring to the table is that a lot of industries require certain compliance or um, certifications for security. My guess would be that probably especially Okta, since it leans in the employee direction, but maybe both bring to the table some certifications that you just basically get for free out of the box just by using the product. Is that true?
Yeah, that's completely correct. And one of the things that um I'm speaking from completely personal experience here, because I had this experience on a live stream where I was writing some code in .NET, and I was trying to add authentication to the application. And one of the things that I love about Auth0 is like literally being able to confirm that you have uh some of the protections in place, or the requirements in place for a specific certification, is the click
Mm-hmm.
of a toggle button.
Mm.
And so it's one of these things where, like, if the toggle button wasn't there and I had to build it by myself, and we talked about this before, right? The number of hours that would go
Yeah.
into writing the code, to testing the code, to
Yeah.
validating that it's doing what you need to, versus literally I just go log in and I'm like, oh, toggle this. Ooh,
Yeah.
nice.
We're now compliant. Good news, boss. Right?
Right. And so this is one of those things where you do sort of say, like, I want to make sure we're spending our time in the places that actually matter.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily want me as a developer writing code to ensure that we align with some compliance process for a particular certification. You
Yeah.
instead probably want me building features.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Focus on your business, right? Not the things that other people have already figured out.
That's exactly right.
So, being at Okta and Auth0, I imagine you've heard some horror stories over the years of people who did security wrong, maybe even,
Yeah.
did it themselves. Is there any of those stories that you're able to share?
I
Anonymized, possibly?
It's a good question. Let me think on this. I don't know what I can say publicly. What I can share though, because I hear stories when I talk to different customers. Sometimes I'm out at events, and I'm listening to folks who have a need for an identity solution and have probably started playing around with Auth0, but then they
Hmm.
start to recognize that they need to add on things, right? So a really good example is often it is the case today, right? When you go to a website and you go to log in, it's like continue with Google, continue with Facebook, right? And so on and so
Hmm.
forth.
Yeah.
And one
The
of the
social
scenarios that a
logins.
lot of folks, Mhm. And
Yeah.
one of the folks that a lot of folks don't think about, or one of the situations that a lot of folks don't think about is, well, what if I just need to add on another provider? Or
Mm.
alternatively, what if I want to add on a provider and I want to link accounts between two, right? So say
Hmm.
I log in with Google, but then I want to connect it up to my Gmail, and I mean to my GitHub. And so when that happens, then you end up stuck because you're literally trying to figure out parts of like the OpenID Connect flow, and those
Hmm.
specifically parts of the OAuth flow and the OpenID Connect specification. And
Yeah.
where should you inject that point? And how do you get information from the user? All this stuff. And it's the sort of stuff that, like, Auth0 has thought about. We've got a whole framework in place so that if you need to step in during an authentication, you can.
Yeah.
But the alternative is, like, I've actually tried to write some of this code before, and it is not fun. And more people do it than I actually expected. So I'm
Yeah.
often like, hey, did you know we had this thing that you could use called actions, where like post login, you could like jump into the authentication flow and do something?
Mm-hmm. Like sync some
This
data up or something. Yeah.
Exactly. If you need to take that data, go add it to a token, right? And then
Yeah.
from the token, if you need someone to connect up to something else behind the scenes, guess what? You've got the bit of information already available to you. Just go use it.
Yeah.
Instead of, now I'm going to go build a whole new API with a
Hmm.
whole bunch more infrastructure that will
Yeah.
probably only get called once. And I'm like, oh, come on.
Yeah. Really going into the bowels of OpenID Connect and OAuth. Yeah.
And
Definitely
I,
challenging.
I, I legitimately would never dissuade anyone from like reading documentation or reading specifications, but
Hmm.
I guarantee you, like, my time as a developer is probably not best spent reading the full OpenID Connect spec.
Right. That's right. Not when a solution is out there.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, So we've talked a lot about situations where you would use IAM, identity and access management, particularly from a third party company. Can you think of a time when you would specifically not recommend using third party
Ooh,
IAM?
I the scenario that I just talked to someone about.
Mhm.
I met someone while I was at a conference last week, and they are relatively new to the industry. And they are still trying to get their feet wet in terms of understanding like just how you build and well, I should say design and architect code, right? And so one of the things that they were asking was like, well, when would you bring in something like an off zero? And I said, well, tell me a little bit more about your use case. And as we're talking more and more about their project, what I'm realizing is they're still really trying to understand the lay of the land. In this case, I wouldn't have them call out to a third party API because they probably wouldn't even understand what to look for, what to be
Mhm.
paying attention to. And yes, while we're easy to use in this way, like they really are still learning the basics, the
Mhm.
fundamentals. And so
Okay.
in a case like that, probably makes sense to stay away.
Yeah.
Another example is I was talking to another developer who live streams on Twitch, and they've got a small application that only they use to manage all of their appearances in public spaces. And so it's very much a one person application
Hmm.
where they want to be able to protect the information,
Yeah.
but they're the only ones who will ever log into it.
Okay. Yeah.
Probably overkill to add in a third party identity provider, right? Because you don't
Right.
need it for that sort of a use case.
Yeah.
So it does come down to like where and how you want the application to be used. But
Right.
if it's something where, it's just a couple of people, maybe one or two, it probably isn't as worth it, right? Versus
Mm.
um if you have plans to scale this thing, well then this gets really interesting.
Yeah. 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 Okay. So you're saying if the password is hard coded in the code, then probably identity and access management might be overkill.
Yeah, though let me just say, I would be a terrible Okta employee or off zero developer advocate if I said leave that password hard coded in the code.
Exactly. Even if it's just for you, it's probably not the right place. Put it in a
That's right.
CI/CD pipeline or something, right?
That's exactly right. Well, and
All right.
it's I saw this question on Twitter around, I think it was from David Fowler, where he was asking, um, uh, how do people who use CI/CD update their secrets in production? Do they
Oh yeah.
use like a secrets manager or a key vault or something like this? And
Yeah.
I'm like, so long as the answer is not I hard coded, I'm gonna
Yeah.
take it.
I leave it on a sticky note on my desk, right?
That's right.
Well, you alluded earlier, Corey, to some of the future stuff that's coming down the pipe for identity, and I think there's a
Mhm.
lot of exciting developments going on there. I know Auth0 and Okta are working on these things. I know, Google's and Facebook's of the world are working on these things as
Yeah.
well. Uh, what future authentication technology are you most excited about right now?
Yeah, there's two things that come to mind. One is in all things authentication, and one is in all things authorization. Um, and I'll start with the authentication piece, which is for a long time, part of the problem with authentication is that we actually have to use passwords. Like, if you really think about this, like, really what you're trying to just verify is that a person says is who they say they are.
Mhm.
And so we've gotten so comfortable with using passwords that that's just the way we've done it. And
Mhm.
so much has been designed around the notion of a password. So now we
Mhm.
added a multiple factor, right? Or we added a second factor. And that came with a text message. And then that changed to a notification. And, maybe you can check your email and you get a magic link. Well, and then you could have gone passwordless. And so I am very, very, very excited to see that continue to evolve into what we are now calling passkeys, which
Mhm.
is this notion that I could use something like a biometric device, right? Like Face ID or like Windows Hello, which I've been using on my computers for years. And websites will then have access to that information to then identify me. So that way, I never have to put a password in ever again. I love that one because,
Yeah.
humans are notoriously fickle, right? And so we'll do things like set 123 123 as our password.
Yep.
But instead of doing that and leaving that even as an attack vector, well, now we're instead using something that's a bit more secure and it uses public key cryptography behind the
Mm,
scenes.
mm,
Um, so I'm excited about that. The second side to this is I'm excited about what's called fine grained authorization. And fine grained authorization is this notion that, typically once someone like logs into an application, right, and the authentication has been successful, then comes, well, what should you have access to? And so we've done roles and we've done what's called attribute based access control, where there are details about you that come with your authentication. And so
mm,
we've used that to determine what you can and can't access on the screen.
mhm,
And so fine grained authorization is a different model. It's, well, what's your relationship to the thing that you're trying to access?
mm,
Say, you, Jay, as a person who hosts a podcast, you should have access to the recordings in a certain way, right? Versus
mhm,
me, I should also have access to those recordings, but maybe with a different set of permissions because our relationships are different.
mm,
And so
mm.
fine grained authorization gives you a way to model that.
Okay.
And I'm excited about that because to me, it changes the way we think about
Mm.
just what it means to authorize people in applications. So
Yeah.
I think those two are like on the precipice of really getting interesting. And now we're needing to see more real world use cases, some more demos and things of this regards.
Okay.
I'd add one more, which is verifiable credentials, but that's a whole other beast. Because I
Okay.
love this idea that like we're moving away from cards as like ways to recognize people and more you have a digital asset that can
Yeah.
truly be used to verify you are who you say you are. That's a whole
Nice.
other story for a different day.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, those do sound like some exciting technologies, and I use a password manager. I imagine you probably do too. And I would be so lost without that now. But something that truly identified me as me without me having to have some piece of information in my head would be fantastic. And if it was fast, it would be even more fantastic. So that's awesome.
Well, and the biggest opportunity for me is always to your point around like if it was fast, it's
Yep.
always been the user experience. The user experience around authentication has always left a lot to be desired.
Hmm.
And so, you see signs today of people doing things like progressive profiling, where they ask you one question like, hey, tell me your name. And then it goes to a next page and it's tell me your email. And then it goes to another page and it asks for other information. And my
Hmm.
sense on this is, yeah, that's a nice stab. But what if we could just completely eventually get rid of that password, which they're going to ask for at a certain point?
Yep.
And you can do it today with like things like magic links and a whole bunch of other stuff. But I
Sure.
say it to say I think the future just continues to get exciting for making that experience so
Yeah.
much more intuitive and so much more pleasurable and something that
Yeah.
people are like, oh yeah, I really liked that. We should probably stop using passwords.
Yes. Yes, as it becomes more consistent and more fast, I'm excited about it. Right now, when I encounter a new app and it uses a different way of logging in than everything else that I use every day, it feels like just another problem, especially if
Yup.
it's not fast. But we got to try new things like that. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
O- Okay, last question, Corey. Uh, we've been talking a lot about identity and access management, which I think we could talk about for quite a bit longer.
Yeah.
Uh, but we like to talk about a lot of topics on the podcast here that will help people make their software projects more predictably successful. My
Mhm.
question to you is what other topics or what other people should we be talking to about that?
So I don't think I shared this. I'm a .NET developer. I've been a .NET developer for a really long time, and I try to keep up with the latest and greatest. And there are sort of two things that are going on right now for me that are really interesting. One is around all things Blazor and what it means to transform the way that we build web-based applications in .NET.
Mm-hmm.
And so Blazor has been on its own path of evolution from the very beginning when they even then tried to rename it and then they renamed it back to Blazor. Different story for a different day as well. But I say that to say I would love to hear an interview with Steve Sanderson, who is
Okay.
the father of Blazor.
Yeah.
I think that would be fantastic. That's one person.
Okay.
Um, the second is as a .NET fanboy and member of the developer community,
Uh-huh.
I've been paying a lot of attention to what's happening with .NET Aspire. For those who don't know,
Mm-hmm.
It is a different way to take a distributed application and build it locally in your developer environment without
Mhm.
worrying about things like how do we connect up all of the components. It makes it super simple and easy and straightforward.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear the conversation on how Microsoft's reaction to like the community's reaction to Aspire sort of
Mhm.
changed the roadmap, and it changed how they decided to roll this thing out and how
Yeah.
they're evolving it moving forward. Because I'm excited to see where that thing goes.
Yeah. Well, those are both two podcast episodes I would certainly listen to. So I agree with you on both of those. As fellow .NET nerds, I agree.
Yeah.
Well, Corey, thanks so much for your time and for answering my questions about identity and access management and for all you do in the community as well.
Jay, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I'm excited to be here and excited to help however I can. So if folks have questions, feel free to find me out on the Twitters and the LinkedIns at Corey L. Weathers. Happy to chat.
Sounds good. CoreyLWeathers.com or Corey L.
Not just
Weathers on
Corey L.
social.
Weathers.
Okay.
Yeah, just
Sounds
Corey
good.
L. Weathers on social. Though I should actually get my website. That's a good call out.
Yeah. Quick register it before we post this episode, right?
That's right.
All right. Thanks so much, Corey.
Thanks, Jake.
That's the end of this Blue Blazes podcast. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this one with industry experts focused on how to make software projects more predictably successful, make sure to subscribe. Trailhead can be found online at trailheadtechnology.com, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks for listening.